this is a major landmark for us here in South Central, right? The Coliseum is a symbol of our community. A lot of us identify with that symbol, right? Like, hey, that's home, right? University of South Central, right? And so I think it's important to note, right? Like, these assets exist in our community, have been here forever, right? The Rose Garden, the museums have been housed here, right? Have been a fabric of South Central, right? No, it's still there. Yeah, it's still there. And if you see who's the ones using the park itself, it's local folks, residents in the neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? And this is the kind of green space that South Central is really itching for, right? There's a lot of people in South Central, right? Over 150,000 people live in our section of town, right? That's highly dense, right? They're about to build the George Lucas Museum, right? But I think it's also important to note, right? Like, to me, Expo Park in the Coliseum also brings other memories, right? So we have the Olympics coming up, right? The Coliseum is going to host a lot of the events of the Olympics. Last time the Olympics came to Los Angeles was 1984. One of the legacies of that Olympics, though, that we often don't think about, right? The open letter to LAPD to have warfare on our streets against gangs, right, and violence. During the 1984 Olympics, LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, who was a very racist person, those who never heard of his name, he started doing, active raids in the streets of South Central, right, to control the gang infestation for the 1984 Olympics, right? The city leaders felt that was a successful model, so they went ahead and approved what became Operation Hammer. Operation Hammer was a program by LAPD to combat drugs and gangs in the city of Los Angeles, right? The way it played out, they particularly concentrated. What's it called? The communities that got impacted the highest was Boyle Heights and South Central, right? They would do raids, right, of black and brown youth, right, whether or not they were gangs, right? And they were big about sending messages to these communities, right? So there's two main big events around this neighborhood that comes to mind to me, right? One occurred in April of 1988. LAPD did a massive sweep, right, in the streets of South Central. Over 2,000 youth were arrested in the same day. That's so many that the precincts couldn't handle processing. So they ended up doing the processing out here in the parking lot of the Coliseum. So if you could imagine that day, right, the chaos, because all their families were outside the perimeter trying to figure out what's happening to their fam, right? Like, police was just grabbing folks, right? Like, that's when the whole gang junction concept was created, right? More than two is considered a gang, right? And people were processed, people were put in the system. That really felt an invasion of the community, right? The other instance occurred later on that year in August on 39th and Dalton. So I don't know if folks of longtime residents may remember this, right? So one of the things Operation Hammer introduced was the concept of a battering ram, right? Literally a tank to knock out a wall of somebody's house, right? Word. The police militarized, right? The police were using these military tactics to intimidate our communities, right? Because they were about symbols, right? They would write graffiti on the walls of the buildings, talking about Crips must die and stuff like that, right? And so it makes sense, right? Because think about now the whole gang mentality within law enforcement, right? The sheriffs, LAPD, they carry themselves like that, right? A lot of that got originated during this time of the 80s, right? 80s and 90s, right? These streets was hot because there was a crack epidemic. There was guns and violence in the streets, right? So anyway, this building on 39th and Dalton was the community had phoned in because there was a lot of drug dealing going on in the block, right? LAPD decided to make a raid of that place and concentrate on two buildings in particular, right? They went in there and destroyed the place, like literally destroyed everything, all their worldly possessions, the walls and everything. The apartments that they raised were innocent people, had nothing to do with anything. They didn't find no drugs, they didn't find no nothing, right? And they arrested like half the block that day, right? Like it was like crazy, right? The amount of damage, and it was unnecessary, right? Like it was literally a warfare tactic, right? Of intimidation, of violence, right? To combat this community, right? And I think the part, so these are things that were up. These are the reason I bring these stories up. The uprising in '92 didn't occur just because of Rodney King, and I think that's something that I want to dispel for folks right now, right? That's something that was built up for decades, right? And that was the moment when people finally got fed up, right? Because the community, imagine the trauma. I mean, folks had family, folks had neighbors, people you know, right? Who all of a sudden were homeless. The Red Cross had to house people, right? Because their units were uninhabitable, right? You know, ultimately LAPD ended up, you know, settling for like $4 million, but there was no accountability to those cops, right? None of them got fired. None of them got prosecuted. They tried to prosecute them, but the code of silence amongst police didn't allow for any evidence to be brought forth, right? But it's just an instance, right, of this relationship with cops and the combative nature with our communities, right? And what these places can also symbolize, right? Like I share that story because that's what comes to mind. It was this corner where they were housing everybody, right? This is before the Expo Center was there. Expo Center is a legacy of that, right? You know, of trying to transform that space so something from negative to something positive, right? Like I said, that's these are facts. This is not my opinions of what happened, right? These are actual facts of situations that occurred in our communities, right? That we don't know about, that we don't learn about regularly, but we should, because that paints a picture of why our relationships are the way they are nowadays, right? History serves as a lesson for us to learn from, right? To be able to get better, to grow, right? And it's important for us to have those conversations.